This section is going to look at the actual neural pathways of the sympathetic and parasympathetic ANS. And all of these pathways are going to include, starting with the central nervous system into the peripheral nervous system, and then eventually go to some kind of target organ. So from the central nervous system, we have what's called a pre-ganglionic fiber. And then it's going to synapse in some ganglion. And then you'll have a nerve that goes from the ganglion to the target, and that is called the post-ganglionic nerve. So the preganglionic fiber, that's the one going from the central to the ganglion. So pre means before. These are myelinated, so these are going to look like white matter. And then the postganglionic fiber, those are unmyelinated, so these are going to look gray. These go from the ganglion to the target. So, for example, down here, the central nervous system is looking at a spinal nerve, and the target is the heart. So in the sympathetic, the preganglionic is very short, and the postganglionic is pretty long. So this is a sympathetic chain ganglion, so this is going to be really, really close to the spine. And then in the parasympathetic, the preganglionic fibers are fairly long, and the ganglion are going to be very close to the target. And then this post-ganglionic fiber is going to be very short. So we'll start with the sympathetic. This is our fight or flight response. These are going to come from the thoracic and lumbar. So this is sometimes called the thoracolumbar division. Regions of the spine, so from T1 all the way down to L5. These have short preganglionic fibers that are myelinated, and they typically synapse very close to the spine. So next to the spine, we have the sympathetic chain ganglion, and that's this yellow feature running up and down both sides of the spinal cord. And the nerves are going to connect to here from the communicating rami, and then these can actually convey these nerves all the way up and down the body. Some of these don't synapse here. There are a couple of what are called collateral ganglion. So the celiac, superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric, these are going to be in the solar plexus, which is a bundle of nerves and vessels in kind of your central abdominal cavity. And then you have another collateral ganglion over here. That's the adrenal medulla on top of the kidney. So there are a couple of preganglionic neurons that are pretty long, but for the most part, these preganglionic neurons are fairly short. And then they're going to synapse to a postganglionic neuron that's going to go all the way to the target. And this is not a one-to-one relationship. So there's no one preganglionic for one postganglionic. These kind of create a net of nerves that are distributed here. So the sympathetic chain ganglion can do this preganglionic to postganglionic pathway in 3 different routes. So number 1 is the spinal route, and these numbers are going to correspond on here. So number 1, we're looking at the nerves come out of the spinal cord, down the ventral root here, and then out into the spinal nerve. So you can see that this part here is the actual spinal nerve where it's going to come out of the vertebral column. So this first pathway is going to follow the spinal nerve into the sympathetic chain ganglion. It's going to synapse right here at this level, go right back to the spinal nerve, and then right out to the post-ganglionic neuron, and then eventually to its target. So this is going to take it to places that are pretty close by, sweat glands, the skin, blood vessels, some other skeletal muscles of the back. Route number 2 is called the sympathetic nerve route. So it's going to again start here in the spine, come down this ventral root out into the spinal nerve. And then instead of synapsing here, this can go either up the sympathetic chain ganglion or down the sympathetic chain ganglion. So down here we can see one synapsing to go to different organs at the lower level from the spine, and then this one going to different organs from the upper level, so places like salivary glands, lungs, heart, all of the thorax, esophagus. And then the third route is the splanchnic nerve root, and these are going to start in the same place, come on out, and come through the spinal nerve, and then they don't stop or change direction in the sympathetic chain ganglion. They're going to just continue out. The reason they're called splanchnic is because they're going to use a splanchnic nerve to continue out to one of these collateral ganglion, whether that's in the solar plexus or the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is actually two glands. So we've got the medulla here in the center, and then the cortex out here on the outer side. And these two different glands come from embryologically two different origins, and they have two very different functions. So this outer cortex is going to be involved with hormones. So this is going to be mostly endocrine, and you'll do this in chapter 17 when you get to ANP2. And then the inner medulla is going to release a lot of those stress hormones that we associate with fight or flight. So epinephrine and norepinephrine and dopamine. So these are going to be the adrenaline hormones that are going to be released. The parasympathetic, so this is our rest and digest division, is often called the craniosacral division. So it's going to have preganglionic fibers coming from the actual cranial nerves on the brain, as well as down here in the sacrum, so S2 to S4. These have really long preganglionic fibers, and then the ganglia that they terminate in is very near the organ. So each of these ganglia is going to be very close to the target organ. A bunch of these are cranial nerves that you've already learned. So oculomotor, that's number 3, is going to come over here to control the movements of the eye. Facial, that's number 7. So that's going to come up here to some of these salivary glands, lacrimal gland. And then glossopharyngeal, number 9, coming down here to this big parotid salivary gland. The vagus nerve is number 10. That's a huge nerve. That comes all the way down into the thorax, and this is going to contain something like 90% of the parasympathetic preganglionic nerve fibers. There's a few down here in the pelvic nerve that are going to use some pelvic splanchnic nerves to reach some of the lower things on the body, like the genitals, ovary, uterus, penis, scrotum, as well as the urinary bladder. So take a moment and differentiate between the 3 roots for the sympathetic nervous system: spinal, sympathetic, and splanchnic nerve roots.